Hello, everybody, and welcome to our world today, the Unionist perspective. Today, we're looking at a few topics that we believe highlight some interesting developments in the world of politics and just generally in the world. And so I believe that these topics start to kind of highlight that while things may sometimes have been a surprise to people there because people were caught off guard, they sometimes have been years in the making if we paid attention to it. And I think that that's really the purpose, is that while we wouldn't want to be completely participative of it, we would always want to be aware of what is happening in the world around us. And through the Unionist perspective, we hope to shine a lens on what has been happening. So I'm going to open it up to the team and find out which one of these was kind of top of mind for you in terms of highlighting the state of news in the world today.
Yeah, so today is quite a geopolitical one, I guess, because we're talking about a lot of things around the world and relationship between countries and inside countries and analysis of what's been going on for these countries. And the preface that we have is actually a podcast, which is the Rogan experience, pretty I would say like people would describe him as rambunctious, I guess, kind of unconventional. But he, back in January, beginning of January, he indicted Peter Zeihan. I guess I hope I'm pronouncing his name well. And Peter Zeihan is, I guess, kind of a geopolitical expert, analyst, author. And the thing that is interesting is that he went really, really, really in depth in the situation in Russia. And he actually described how Russia was trying to invade Ukraine like 8 times in the past 20 years, obviously. So there were like precursors of that, but this time was different. It was different because of the response of West and Ukraine. And also it was different because it was kind of a desperate response in order for most Russians to feel like they would save their country, which is going towards potentially a total collapse before 2017. And so he talks about that, talks a little bit about China as well. I was kind of surprised to see how many details he included in that, but I thought it was really interesting that the thought about the choices around fear and desperation that we've been analyzing for more than a year were being highlighted into a professional podcast. And I felt like it would be interesting to kind of dive, maybe not in like how the war will end, because we don't actually know. There's no like concrete response at this time that would help us know like how exactly it is going to end, but actually like how we can kind of see the beginnings of the collapse of societies like Russia and China just by the choices that they've been making. And the biggest one is that it said that Russia doesn't have the next generation leader, most potentially because like there's a generational gap in Russia, but also because like there is a culture of communism, of being so paranoid, even more now that Putin is in power, that everyone from the KGB or leaders have been suppressed. And so it's so funny that he said that, and then we had the coup from Prigozhin, or the attempted coup, and now he died in a plane crash, and now Putin is trying to make his mercenaries swear allegiance to Russia's government. So pretty interesting stuff. And I just feel like we should dive deep into like you guys' thoughts and emotion about that, and maybe a bit of spiritual truth about how the geopolitical spectrum has been playing out for this more than first half of the year.
Yeah, Irina, I thought that was really interesting to hear from him, from Peter Zeihan, that I think he pronounces it Zion, but I don't know. I think so. But to hear about Russia and some of the brief history behind it and why it is so, it's not destined for stability, in this century. And I thought that was really cool. And it shows you how, if you have a system that is based on like fear and paranoia and control, and it's just about people try to get to the top so that they can take a larger share of the country's economic pie for themselves, basically, and for like egomaniacal reasons. How that like keeps your country from being sustainable, because he was talking about how like what happened was in the like after Brezhnev was one of the leaders of the USSR, whatever the word they used was, general secretary or something, I don't know. There was like kind of a coup, and the leader who rose up was, I think it was Andropov or Chernenko, but they like, both of them were really short-lived in their positions. So they both died like less than a year into their positions, which is not a surprise because of how they got there, because they were part of the KGB, the intelligence community. It was kind of a coup because in the Soviet Union, there's no way to determine who's going to be the next leader. So it's all based on intrigue and threats and jockeying and deal making and possible assassinations. And it's just really nasty. And that's how these leaders got into power. And then Putin was part of that too. And they kind of knew how to run the country the best of anyone because they were the intelligence services. So they understood Russia's system. But the problem with their system is that because they so badly want to hold on to control for themselves and want to take from others, they don't want information getting out beyond their inner circle. So that's what you were talking about, Irene, is that only this like KGB, these KGB alumni have been in the elite in Russia. And Putin, like you said, has imprisoned or had killed or like spirited away all of these people who don't agree with him. So he basically has like 130 of his like old pals from the KGB who know anything about how the country functions. So there isn't anybody else with leadership potential and who really knows the inner workings of Russia. So I thought that was really interesting. And I'm glad that their system isn't sustainable, because it's a really nasty system and it's producing a lot of chaos for the world. So I guess that's kind of good news. It's not really good news. Well, it is kind of good news too for Russians, because if they're tyrannical governments and stable, maybe they can be shocked out of the propaganda mentality and kind of be made to think like, oh my God, like, do I really stand for what our leaders have stood for? Like, do we really want this? Or yeah, do we not? So that's what I felt from it. But yeah.
So interestingly, when there's a kind of deluge of leadership potential coming up the ranks, I feel like it might be on a level beneficial, but it also on a level very unbeneficial to the stability of a country, to its economy, to the global economy. Because while we might all not agree that certain types of leadership are beneficial and supportive of nations, there's also the component of some type of institutional knowledge that needs to be passed on, because I've worked in corporates for the longest, for over 20 years now. Well, in a couple of corporates for a long time now. And I just find that the level of a lack of institutional knowledge always destabilizes things significantly more than if there was a little bit of a leadership that needed to be challenged and amended and that kind of thing. So my concern is if there's a gap from the perspective of future leaders in a country, what does that do for not only the economy of that country, but its political system, its participation in world politics, and also how much more does it have the potential to destabilize what's already unstable? And so I'm not advocating for the baton to be passed to more delinquents, as we would call them. But I am saying that if there's a hole in the bucket, that the drainage through that hole creates a lot more systemic issues than if those holes were smaller, and if that uncomfortable leadership was to be challenged. So there's definitely a case to be made for institutional knowledge being passed on and forward. But again, I suppose what's beneficial under these circumstances is that it does present the opportunity for future generations to learn in a different way, and therefore apply leadership lessons in a different way, which in the long term is likely to bring about better systemic change and a healthier political landscape than if we kind of had the steady stream of the same mind and the same behavior in certain political systems.
Well, I think what Zeihan was saying, how can I phrase this? But what Peter Zeihan was saying was that Russia was only the iceberg of some type of big systemic collapse, and the world ends now, that kind of way that he was explaining in his statement and in his book. And Rogan in his book himself was saying how the society was going to collapse anyway, and basically it's already on the way in some sense. And if we take it from the Unionist perspective, it feels like it's just the apocalypse on the way. And if we're already grounded to it, like, since it's already on the way, it's not going to be a big like tsunami of cries and suffering, in the sense that we see in terms of like biblical verses, but it is going to be very uncomfortable for a lot of people, especially people that chose to to live and stay and incarnate in a nation like Russia. And so there's definitely something that is telling of like the fact that everyone is speaking about the end of an era, about like the world ending and apocalypse, and not even in a very crazy way, just like in a very like, hey, geopolitically, this is going to happen. It seems like we're just seeing how the world is going to be like separated in their choices. Like really, the world is going to be shown their choices. And I guess either people are going to be shocked into awakening, like Sage was saying earlier, or they're going to continue into various choices. But the thing is, like, it's going to be unseen compared to before, because it's going to impact the society at large first, and then it's going to be like we're actually going to be recipient of our own choices and not just the global choices. And that's where it's like the systemic way of living, globalization as we know it, is going to end. And we're going to have a world that is less connected in terms of like we're going to suffer less and bleed less from the mistakes of other people. And obviously, like the goal is to awaken most people to the fact that, hey, there is another way through peace and through stability and through being sincere and honest and choosing that. But with like the picture of Russia that was painted up to even the Orthodox Church leader being like the super propaganda guy, it just feels like there's just something very rotten to the core about society. And it's not even saying that to criticize Russia, but it's really like it is what it is. And I guess that's why we can attest geopolitically to how dire the situation is and how like the collapse is inevitable. And so I guess we can take that with like compassion for our brothers and sisters, but also saying like, hey, this is like the choice that they made. And also like, if it's going to happen anyways in one way or another, like there is a path for them too. So yeah, that was my point. But it definitely feels like apocalypse, but it also feels like it's showing us how apocalypse is just like, hey, it's not like natural catastrophes left and right all the time. It's actually the collapse of how we knew how to live before, in place of something new and more peaceful, the right way coming in, you know. So yeah, feels like Nadia had a lot to say about that.
I just had a feeling that both China and Russia have a similar pattern of decision when it comes to what they're making as living in the now and not living as an internal being, thinking that they must do something for selfish reasons to ground a legacy, but they're not seeing that karmic pattern is going to repeat in itself. And it's already happening through this apocalypse, that they will be shown their decisions and it will be a very rude awakening for them. So, which is already unfolding. But yeah, I see both similarities, that they don't think that their life will return. They think that this is it now and it's done and they can do whatever they want. But it's definitely not the case.
Yeah, I feel in something about this though that I was feeling too, like spiritually, is that there's like no reason for all of this other than like just somebody not believing in love or not trusting love, basically. Like, I remember Jeff was chatting with us and he said once that like the Russian leadership and like the overall consensus is that Russia can't succeed if it's honest. Like it has to like be tricky to succeed. And I'm like, yeah, but that's not true, you know. And that guy Peter Zeihan was saying, well, Russia wants to control Eastern Europe because that way there's like it runs up against like mountains and there's only this small little pass of flat land that people could go through to invade it, and it can just put all its soldiers there, somewhere in Eastern Europe, and then the rest is mountains, so you can't get tanks over that. So now Russia's safe. And I'm just like, he never goes into or does he? I don't know. He doesn't go into like the psychosis of that, because it's like, who wants to invade Russia? Nobody. We all have a military alliance in NATO because Russia wants to invade people. You know, it's like someone who, I don't know, it's like someone who's like an abuser or whatever, being like, oh my God, I've got to protect myself because I think everyone's out to get me. And it's like, no, you're out to get others. But the reason you think others are out to get you is because you're out to get others. And so it's just a loop of insanity and it doesn't make any sense. And the only reason that Russia hasn't been able to get out of that loop is because of not wanting to humble itself and be like, hey, like we were wrong. Like we don't need to have another Stalin type leader who's like, I am defending, you know, the existence of Russian state against the aggressive West, you know, like, and that's their whole narrative. And they still haven't gotten over that, you know, from like the World War II. That's all I can see, is that they're just not humbling themselves, I guess, and just choosing to let go of that, because that seems to be Putin's only playbook for being like a popular leader. What he could have been doing is invest in the education system, solve the country's problems internally, and focus on himself and on his own country. But it seems like that's not working. And yeah, so, or they haven't been doing that, I'm sorry. Not that it's not working. So I'm just like, and I do have compassion there, and I'm like, that's such a pity, because you don't need to be that way. And we can talk about China too, and I feel like it's the same way. I'm like, you guys, you don't need to be this way. You don't need to choose this. You know, that was my thinking about it. Yeah.
But you know, I think Zion actually gave a new level of comprehension there, is that in the last 10 years before the Cold War ended, with the end of USSR as well, people were made very self-aware of the way of how easily like their country could collapse. And I think in the past 30 years, they stayed in that state of, we're going to collapse, which is kind of true, actually. Like, it was like, his explanation was like, it's with the way they are making choices, like it's inevitable. And so what it feels like, it's that it's not just them trying to say people are attacking them. It's like spiritually they're collapsing and they're projecting this upset on other people and attacking them. And so in return, fearing that other people will attack them. And so fearing that other people will attack them is just the lie to cover the actual thing that they're attacking themselves into collapse. And I like that we have that new dimension there, which finally explains the insanity that we've been seeing spiritually, about like, why the fuck would they feel like they're the victim where they've been the one attacking people? And it's like just basic projection. And we talked about that since the very beginning of the conflict with Ukraine, the projection of this fear. But now we have a new dimension of why this projection is here. But yeah. And same with China, I guess it's, as you said, I think he was right on our arrogance about like recognizing their patterns. And for China, it's true. And I think we may also need to talk about some countries where we feel like the choice is not yet quite clear, but we're seeing kind of the same things happen, or we're not feeling too good about their decision. And it's the fact that there's a BRICS summit about a new world order, trying to redo the third world country that Nasser tried to do, I guess 70 something years ago. But it kind of feels like it's for I almost want to say selfish reasons, but also in the sense like they have that same pattern of feeling like they've been either left out or attacked by the West. And so China, obviously, and Russia are included in this group. So if you want to talk about China and Brazil and South Africa and India, like if it's the right time to go into that kind of nonsense as well that we've seen this week, or that kind of incomprehension about the decision that they made. And yeah, how do you guys feel about that?
So I just want to touch on the self-fulfilling prophecy concept, because while we're all calling it insanity, the fact of the matter is that you need to be quite personally and psychologically astute to realize your own pattern. And literally, that is the primary premise of where your healing starts from, is that you recognize that you are running a certain pattern, and that certain pattern is influencing your reality in a way that you probably don't appreciate and would not like to continue. So we look at these nations and we go, okay, so they've been running this projection, self-fulfilling prophecy pattern for quite a while, but we also need to remember that all of those things, while seeming to be insane, also have a very strong pattern arising out of struggle and lack. And whether you were the perpetrator of the struggle or a recipient, a perceived recipient of the struggle, it's almost encoded into a national DNA. So the healing required is literally to be astute and be aware, and to look and to be prepared to look in the mirror that's being held up to you, as opposed to trying to smash the mirror every time it gets held up to you, so that you can continue to fulfill your own self-perpetuated pain and all those other kind of things. And so when we have countries that look to relive what they would have perceived as their glory days, we kind of have to understand that insanity might be very visible to us because we're looking from the outside in. But when you're on the inside and you're not looking at what is being reflected, but rather what is visible, and not perceiving it as a mirror, you won't realize that at the core of it sits you, directing and acting kind of thing. It's kind of your judge, jury, and executioner of your own demise. But you kind of have to, as with human beings, you have to be aware of your own bullshit. And if you're not, you are going to perceive everybody to be against you and be a threat and live in fear. And let's be honest, the political landscape of the world evolved out of a system of fear. And those fears are still playing out constantly. So where you would have felt disempowered or weak, or even the very opposite of being the megalomaniac that you are, without wanting to look in the mirror, patterns would have perpetuated. And the more something was changed, largely against your will, the more you would have been backed into a corner. And what happens to a dangerous animal that is backed into a corner? They retaliate. They become violent, because just like us, having your back against a wall puts you in fight mode. It doesn't generally put you in flight mode, because there's nowhere to flight to. Your back is against a wall. So you go into fight mode. And I think we need to remember that the majority of humanity, for the longest time, has been in fight mode. And so there are people that automatically will start to fight where others might start to retreat and look for alliances, so that they are in a more powerful position to respond at a later point. It's psychology 101. And there's a lot of psychology to politics at this point in time, in terms of people that perceived things to have been taken away, because generally when people perceive something to have been taken away, they feel affronted. You took from me and I want it back. And it's just the condition of how certain people respond to circumstances versus other people responding to circumstances. So there's a lot of self-fulfilling prophecy happening, agreed, but underlying the core of it, there's still this almost human element of feeling hard done by, partly, but there's also the human element of wanting to be powerful and lording power over others. So there's a lot of dynamics at play, which, for lack of a better phrase, kind of creates the stew where parts of the food is tasty and parts of the food just leave a horrible bitter taste in your mouth. And then you'd start to form these alliances like G7 and BRICS and the G20 and the G8 and everything else. And, like you kind of look at this and you go, okay, so there's this buffet. And if you look at the meals on the buffet, there's a lot of them that leave something to be desired. So let's form our own little stew on the side. And hopefully the meal that we eat tastes better than the meal options being presented. And then you look at what makes up the stew and you go, okay, we're putting some spice of human rights abuses, and we're putting some spice of economic underhanded trade, and we're hoping that this meal is going to be better. And if we look at it from the inside out, you're kind of going, well, none of your meal options are appealing. So what else is the alternative? And I think that that's really what's at play here, is that there's a lot of searching for alternatives, but this kind of the meal that's being presented smacks very similarly to what the meal options were before.
I kind of like the image, and I want to go deeper into the practicality of it all, in the sense that for BRICS, like, what do they feel is their perceived reality? What is visible to them? What is actually their choice? And what is the potentially unsavory meal that they're offering on the table right now? And yeah, let's go through that so that it's made clearer like what the choices actually are.
So interestingly enough, because I've just actually attended a presentation today where we looked at what would have been the contribution of the current BRICS countries to the global GDP over the last 15 years, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And you can very easily see that the contribution of the BRICS countries to the global GDP, while not as significant as something like the G8, has shown growth. And the proportionate growth in the contribution from these BRIC countries has been higher than the proportionate growth of like the G7 countries, for instance. So there's definitely a political and economic power play that's underlying this desire to form a bigger BRICS contingent. Because literally, trade relationships are what drive the global economy. And so the contributors to the bigger proportion of contribution to the G8 the G7 contributors to the global GDP would have the greater proportion of voice in any of those conversations. And I think that's what is at play, is that desire to gain some level of leverage by growing the BRICS contingent. And the projection is that in the next 10 years, the BRICS contributors in the format of the new BRICS, and we don't really know what they would be calling themselves going forward, given all these new inclusions, but their projected contribution to global GDP will grow. And I think that's what they're aiming for. Well, it's projected to grow. And I think that's what they're aiming for. It's this greater voice around the table. Because a lot of the time, these things are literally based on your economic power allows you to have a louder voice, and therefore probably influence how trade is structured in a more powerful way, because you're never going to have absolute power, but a greater share of the power because you make a greater contribution. And I think that's what's being aimed for. Probably what's happening is they're not articulating it in that way, but it's definitely a power play. There's still a power play at hand, because if we look at what has happened, whether we like it or not, the world order, G7, G8, G20 dictate a lot to developing and emerging economies. And I think it's almost time and trying to stop the level of being dictated.
Can you guys explain more about that? Because I'm not sure how, what the impacts are, and like what it is that they are desiring there. And I was also hearing, this doesn't seem like it's going to happen, but I was also hearing that one of the things they talked about was creating like an alternative, like global currency or something like that, because like apparently, I guess all the countries of the world are like, their value is like determined in relation to the US dollar, basically, instead of like a fixed supply of like gold, basically. All these countries don't have like gold reserves anymore. They're saying our money value is like relative to how our economy is doing versus the US dollar. And so I heard that, but I was like, obviously, I watched a video too from Peter Zeihan about this, and he was like, yeah, it's not going to happen. These countries like do not agree with each other about much of anything. And yeah, I don't know. Vague question, but can you explain more about like what the BRICS countries would be seeking, how they feel like they're controlled and dictated to by the G7 or G8? Please help. Thank you.
Well, I think your question points exactly to where it starts to feel bad. Because in theory, on paper, it seems like it's a glorious project. And we talked about that last week. We would like to see a new system with more stability in the indexation of finances, for example, financial markets. But there's just something about like, if the desire is just power and not actually serving people and the global economy in the sense that it can be a better contributor to our globalized system, it's never going to work because they don't agree. Like even the countries that are closest in terms of alliances mostly don't agree with each other today. Currencies are super hard to change. Euro was almost downed Europe if it wasn't as powerful financially. So I don't see how countries that have less of a power in terms of finance could sustain that. But the thing is, I don't even think that they went as far as this in terms of reflection, because for me, it was for now just a political and communication announcement, and the work was to be done after and will be done after. The problem is that they don't think in terms of how plausible this is. And spiritually, if we were to be truthful, the true way to have your power is not to try to remove it or take it from your opponent. It is really to take your real place into the system that already exists, so that your way of peace can be the way shower for everyone else. And I think that's something that they haven't understood in the past century. Normal, it's part of like the patterns and relationships with the system that they have to heal, especially because it's also linked to the history of people of color. So obviously, like there's a lot of like not feeling like they're part of the system, not feeling respected, and though they do have power there. And also like you have to comply to reality that even though you are growing a lot, like there are still like the G7 is made out of people that have a bigger GDP than you, and also have a better stability in certain instances. And so you have to respect that there are countries that are going to be the leadership, and that you have your word and you can contribute to a system where you're heard better, where the communications are better made, even though there is a clear leader in that. However, if you spend the past century of your independence trying to be removed and resenting of the people in power that are actually in place, you have never tried to truly incorporate yourself and integrate yourself into a system. And that's why something that is actually good on paper is not plausible in a practical way. And that's always the case. But I guess that's the core of our discussion today, is that communism on paper was the best way to have a system where all individuals and society would be equal and have equal chances and be distributed in a very even way. And all the systems that are always created, all these meals added to the buffet, they always tend to be like, we found the way. But if you found the way into separation, then it's probably that it's not the way, you know. And that's the truth that humans are, I guess, not really ready to acknowledge for now, because we wouldn't see it so much in elections and collapsing of societies and separation of globalization and a new BRICS being formed or things like that. So that was kind of my explanation to it. And the explanation is that it's not plausible in reality. So it's okay that you're asking this question. There's nothing more to explain. It's just that there's an idea, but there's also patterns behind it.
So I think part of the desire, rightly or wrongly, that we see is that it would be very complicated to de-dollarize any type of trade system that has been dollarized for such a period of time. And if anything was going to ever compete with the dollar from a trade point of view, it would have probably been the pound or the euro. And it didn't happen. And so you have these smaller currencies or weaker currency countries trying to form an alliance to compete on a global stage against a solid financial system. And I think it's, as Yureen said, that they're not really proposing a feasible or workable alternative. Because yes, they can manage trade amongst themselves in a different currency, and it probably wouldn't be too complicated to do, given that their currencies aren't as strong. But you wouldn't be able to necessarily introduce a currency the way the euro was introduced. And also, I mean, it's highly unlikely, just the way it happened with Switzerland refusing to be part of the euro because their currency was stronger. Something similar could happen once the BRICS starts to actually see the practicality of how you compare on a like-for-like basis the strength of all of those currencies. And the more you add into the pot, the more complicated it becomes when you now add oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran into this pot, and all of a sudden their currency dictates that they have a stronger voice, yet they also have a history of abuses in other places that probably are not such a great testament to their leadership ability. So you kind of have to weigh these things up and go, practically, does this make sense? I like the idea that you're proposing, but like, is it practical? Can it be done? The answer is yes, it can be done. But the long-term caveat is, how beneficial is it? And to whose benefit is it? And I don't believe that that question is on the table just yet. And if we were to distill it even further, the more primary question is, for what purpose? Because I think that's really the core of it. For what purpose are you doing this? And we probably would apply the concept of chunking, but chunking downwards to get to the truth of the matter is literally to ask the purpose question until we can't ask the purpose question again, so that the lie can be exposed. And I think that's really top of mind. What we should be considering is, for what purpose is it going to be done, and for what benefit, and to whose benefit? And if we ask those questions, we start to probably identify more flaws in the logic than pros in the logic.
That's pretty true, because it, for me, feels like for now I don't see the people being involved in it. I see a bunch of unhappy political leaders saying like, hey, the West has too much power, so we must come in and do our own thing to have power, and it's all beautiful, whatever, in a political mind, I guess, but it doesn't really make sense to someone like me who is from the people, And so if it doesn't make sense for people, it's not going to last, because people do have power. And I think it would be yet another great abuse of their people's power to go against what was truly desired for the people, because the people actually have choice and they need to be respected as well. And right now they're not being respected. We're respecting the ego of people that are whining. That's the energy of it, and that's sad. It would be like the new BRICS would be built on the back of people just being whiny. So, because if you want to have power, you probably don't want to feel like someone that is whining or a victim.
Do you guys feel that this alliance is going to increase the global debt, or how will it change? And if they were to make their own currency, how would the debt change?
So my feeling is that it might actually, and it's literally something that generally happens. That a solution is tabled that probably makes things worse before it makes it better. Because you always have a level of downswing before an upturn. And I'm not certain what level of commitment there is to seeing it through. And that's telling in terms of whether it will happen or not. The fact of the matter is, it can't impact global debt unless they start to forgive each other's debt, which is highly unlikely. So you might have global debt at a level denominated in this currency, and you shift that global debt to be denominated in another currency. But that currency might not necessarily be stronger than the previous one. It might, in essence, be weaker than the previous one, which means that the projection of the debt is higher than lower, because you would have to account for that debt in the new currency. So I don't believe that that it will immediately show an improvement. It might actually show a deterioration, depending on what that new currency is based on. Because you have to account for something like for like. So if the new currency is potentially stronger, so let's say the BRICS currency, for lack of a better, because we don't know what it will be called or what the idea is. So we say BRICS currency versus the South African rand. Now we have South African debt at 5 billion rand, for instance, or proportionately $1 billion in terms of how it's traded right now. But it's actually, in South African rand terms, 5 billion. Now you have this currency that's stronger than the rand by maybe 2 basis points, 3 basis points, whatever. That 5 billion all of a sudden becomes 6 or 7 billion worth in debt. So it doesn't improve the picture up front. in the long term, through trade relationships, you might be able to service the debt better so it comes down in the long term. But in the short term, the picture's going to look worse.
I kind of feel like in a system where China and Iran are going to be, they're not going to be forgiving debt. And if they're not forgiving debt, people are going to say, well, we're not forgiving debt, so I'm not going to forgive debt either. You know, because that's how our world is working right now. And we're not offering something in a different world, just a system in the same world. So it's actually, that's the thing. It's actually the same system presented as a different system. I think that's truly what's bothering with that all. And we see that in like COP21, where everyone say like, hey, we're going to sign and we're going to change. And someone will say, I'm not going to change. So everyone is saying like, oh, it's not changing. So we're good for now. And the crisis still continues, you know, for climate change. And so I guess that's kind of the same. And also like, we've never been in a state where debt is that high overall for every country around the world. So we don't know how it's going to look. And also Europe did a work of decades before they could ever offer European Union and Euro. It was really like decades, starting at the World War II and up until the end of the 20th century when they offered euro as a currency. So, and they did like work with really, really stable countries. So, I don't know, doesn't seem plausible. And who's to say in an economy that is going to experience more and more collapse, for example, from China or Iran again, or Afghanistan, or all is going to end, that down is not going to continue to go down. I think that's probably the worst way to try to separate to do your own system instead of like finding solutions together. But maybe that's my optimistic side that is talking right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, let's be honest, if you listen to some economic stuff, like there's a sense that the world is in hundreds of trillions worth of debt. Like, you're never going. There's never going to be a time where the world has serviced its entire debt. So, like the practicality and feasibility of some of these alternatives just fall flat over and over and over again. Because there's no real movement in terms of the global economy to start to upturn what has been debt. Everybody owes everybody something. And then you have trade denominated in dollars because it's quite a strong currency. And it's literally backed by some serious history. So how do you unwind something like that? It's literally like having a conglomeration of organizations that have been married for hundreds of years and trying to sell off parts of the business, and you don't even know how they're tied to each other anymore. So like it's just the feasibility of it all just sounds ridiculous. And yeah, it is probably more of an exercise in whining than anything else. But having said that, there is a case to be made for greater cooperation. And on that note, we have reached our hour. So thank you to everybody for the conversation, and thank you to everybody that has followed us. Please also feel free to like and subscribe to our Church of Union YouTube channel, and we will see all of you next week for another conversation. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.